Chapter 18. The day of the election now rapidly approached. The Duke, Sir Ambrose, and the rival candidates and the opposition lords were all in London. Deputies were also assembled, and though it was forbidden to declare publicly for whom they intended to vote till the decisive moment arrived, yet the popular feeling seemed so strongly in favor of Rosabella that there appeared scarcely a chance for her rival. Exulting in her expected triumph and confident of her success, Rosabella sate in the splendid boudoir allotted to her by Lord Gustavus's house, musing on her hoped-for grandeur. A large mirror was opposite her, and as Rosabella saw her own fine figure reflected in it, she sparkled in her eyes, and her mind wandered enraptured through the scenes of future glory. Thus completely absorbed in pleasing meditation, Rosabella was not aware that Cheops stood before her, till she heard his full, deep-toned voice repeating her name. "Rosabella," said he. "Rosabella, Queen of England, hail!" "Cheops!" exclaimed she. "Hail to the Queen of England," resumed he. "No longer need you stoop to solicit suffrages. Your fate is sealed." "Think you that I'm quite safe?" asked the princess, her eyes sparkling and her cheeks glowing. "Certainly, there can be no doubt." "Then I may bide defiance to these wretches, and need no longer submit to their caprices or their subservient to their numbers." "Not unless you like it." "Like it!" exclaimed Rosabella, with her eyes flashing fire. "Can you suppose I'd like to practice meanness?" "Policy indeed recommends a contrary course," continued the mummy. "As if you do not assert your own independence, they will encroach upon your condensation and treat you like a slave." Rosabella bit her lips, and her bosom swelled with indignation. The mummy took no notice of her agitation, but went on. "Let them not bind you by any promises. Prove yourself a free and independent sovereign, and trample upon them, and they will crouch at your feet, but crouch to them, and they will trample upon you." "You're right," said Rosabella proudly, "and my would-be masters soon shall find their error. They think weakness has made me submit to their arrogance, but they shall see their folly." The influence the mummy exercised over the minds of those he came in contact with was astonishing. In pursuance of his advice, Rosabella, from this moment, resumed her usual imperious manner, and received the compliments paid to her with the air rather of an empress long seated upon the throne than that of an aspiring candidate for regal honors, dependent only upon the favor of the people. The excessive confidence, however, displeased the deputies. "She hardly leaves us a choice," they said, "for she seems to command us to choose her, notwithstanding the strength of her party and the weakness of her rival. We don't think she should be quite the thing in her own hands, and the old queen ordered that the people should choose her successor, but this princess seems to have chosen herself. It is very kind of her to wish to save us a trouble, but with her good leave, we think we might be managed to go through it without her help." These murmurs, however, though deep, were not loud, the party of Rosabella being too firmly established for anyone to dare openly to oppose it. The opposition lords had all returned to town, and though they had not completely succeeded in their objective to the journey of the country, they had at least satisfied themselves, and by the activity they displayed, given themselves, as they imagined, the just title to the gratitude of their future queen. In the meantime, the friends of Elvira almost despaired. Few persons of note declared themselves her advocates, and though the favorable impression she had made upon the duties still faintly operated, the feeling was fast fading away. The invincible repugnance to appear as the leader of the party oppressed her, and she sank from the public gaze with a little short of horror. Lord Edmund, however, still remained her firm and almost her only friend. But though he exerted every nerve on her behalf, even he despaired of obtaining her election. Sometimes, indeed, he gazed upon her beauty. A selfish feeling crept over his soul, and he could scarcely repress an emotion of joy, as he thought the possibility that she might still be his, for the very qualities that impeded her success only endeared her more yet fondly to his heart. The next instant, however, the nobler feelings would reproach with selfish joy, and with a kind of penitential sorrow he would strive by fresh efforts to destroy the hopes, for the gratification of which his very soul pained. "I presume," said Lord Gustavus de Montfort to Rosabella, the day before that appointed for the election, "Your Highness does not intend to make Mayforth a minister as a general, for thinking as I think, and as I am confident everyone else must think, I feel assured he has no talents for the cabinet." "As Queen of England, my lord," returned Rosabella proudly, "I will not be dictated to, though I will do my best to choose such ministers as I may, in my judgment, be most likely to promote the welfare of my country." Lord Gustavus was thunderstruck, and he gazed after her as she retired, with mingled feelings of astonishment and indignation. "You are not Queen of England yet, however," he said to himself, "and it may be possible you may never be. What pride, what haughtiness! If I had been a slave, she could not have thrown more contempt. When I am Queen of England, said she, and I will not be dictated to. Queen of England, said she. Humph! Thinking as I think, and I am sure everyone else must think, it is possible that it is a contingency that may never arrive. Humph! I will not be dictated to. Humph! Well, certainly I must confess I never heard a more undignified will not in my entire life. It was the hour when Lord Gustavus was accustomed to hold a kind of levee with the partisans of the princess had been in the habit of assembling, all under the guise of casual visitors, and he thus congregated. Lord Mayworth and Dr. Hardman were announced. "My Lord Gustavus," cried the former, "you cannot imagine how impatient I feel to have tomorrow over. The uniform of the household troops is horrible. I have determined to change it, and every instant I am appointed commander-in-chief." "If you should obtain that situation," replied Gustavus doubtfully. "What do you mean?" asked his friend in astonishment. "I thought that means we must be infallibly secure success." "They must ensure the election of Rosabella," replied Lord Gustavus. "And is that not what we all wish?" "Not quite," returned Lord Gustavus dryly. "I do not understand you," said Lord Maysworth. What do you mean?" demanded Dr. Hardman. "I mean," replied Lord Gustavus in his usual cold, precise manner, "that, thinking as I think, and as I'm sure everyone else must think, from the conversation that has just taken place between the princess and myself, I am convinced that our possession of the places she has promised to us is by no means a necessary consequence of her ascension to the throne." "Oh!" cried his auditors, looking perfectly aghast. A further explanation confirmed their fears. "I could not have believed," exclaimed both. As the partisans of Rosabella continued to arrive, they were successively apprised and paralyzed by the appalling news. Divers were the sensations thus excited, and amongst all, notwithstanding their professed disinterestedness, there was not one whose sentiments remained unchanged by the intelligence. In the meantime, Rosabella, in the solitude of her own chambers, became aware of the impudence she had committed, though she brooded in secret over her uneasiness, and felt too proud to avow it to even Marianne, whilst the faithful confidant, quite suspicious of the error of her mistress, exulted in her expected triumph with as much transport as though it had been her own. "Tomorrow," said she, "I shall have to do homage to my queen, and I shall have to rapture the seeing crowds kneeling humbly at her feet. Oh, would the happy day were to come! How tedious will seem this long, long night! How wearisome will be the hours! Does not your heart also throb, princess? Tomorrow I shall see my queen. Tomorrow! Oh, would it were today!" The important day at last arrived, when the delegates assembled in Blackheath Square, awaited with impatience the arrival of the princesses. Each was to deliver a speech, after which a nobleman was to be permitted to address the mob on her behalf, and then the majority of their votes was to decide. The rival princesses appeared, and were hailed with enthusiasm. They were dressed in the utmost simplicity, in the purest white, whilst from their heads hung long veils of gossamer web, the ample folds of which were effectually shielded their persons from observation. They were followed by the respective suites, Lord Gustavus and the opposition lords being most conspicuous that of Rosabella, and Lord Edmund and that of Elvira. The Duke and Sir Ambrose, attended by the Reverend Fathers Morris and Murphy, were among the numbers of spectators, the two former feeling much too agitated to allow their appearing as actors in the scene, and the others being, for different reasons, equally disqualified from taking a part in it. And now all was silent. The tumultuous wave-like heaving of the multitude ceased, and everyone listened in breathless expectation, for the princesses were about to speak. It was an awful moment. The poor old Duke's heart almost beat audibly. He sate, his eyes fixed upon the ground, not daring to look up, and holding the hand of his friend, Sir Ambrose, firmly in his own. It was Rosabella who was to speak first. She advanced with a firm, decided step, and when attendants drew back the veil that covered her, the assembled multitude uttered a shout of admiration at her beauty. Her dark eyes flashed fire as she proudly surveyed the crowd, and anticipated triumph gave an animated glow to her fine features. She looked, indeed, already a queen, and seemed born only to command and be obeyed. The multitude were awed by her presence, and listened with uplifted eyes, in the most profound silence, whilst she thus addressed them. "My lords and gentlemen, I feel the presumption I am guilty of in thus venturing to address the august assembly, but I must the magnitude of the occasion that calls me forward may afford an excuse for my tremidity. I come, gentlemen, to offer myself to you as your sovereign, and the exalted nature of the trust I wish you to repose in me inspires me with courage to deserve it. Yes, gentlemen, I say to deserve it, for I should consider myself unworthy to be appointed your queen, if I were to shrink from performing any of the duties attendant upon the station, and from the most arduous of these I consider that of thus addressing you. I am aware that upon occasions like the present, it is usual for the aspiring candidate to promise miracles of reformation that are to be effected upon by obtaining the power. I promise nothing of the kind, for I will tie myself to no promises. Elect me for your queen, and I will fulfill the duties of my rank according to the best of my own judgment. I will not submit to dictation, neither will I be censured by my subjects. I will be a free and independent sovereign, or I will remain a subject. I scorn to attempt to practice any deception upon you. I wish you to see me as I really am, and then, if you think me worthy of the high office I aspire to, then at least I may assure you you shall never have reason to blush for your choice, nor shall the proud character of England that has been so long maintained ever suffer a strain upon its glory at my hands. Now, my countrymen, haughty as I may be deemed, I assure you, with sincerity, that I have ever held the name of Englishwoman in my boldest boast, and that I should not relinquish my title to it, were kingdoms offered in exchange. I can say no more. If you approve me as your sovereign, your voices will obtain the fulfillment of your wishes. If you do not, words would not tempt me to accept the throne." Rosabella now sate down amidst thunders of applause, whilst acclamations of "Long live Rosabella!" rent the air. The symptoms of approbation were, however, only produced by her beauty and her commanding manner, for when men came to analyze her speech, they found it much to disapprove. The haughty manner in which she had disavowed control, indeed, was neither calculated to win new friends, nor secure those she already had, as the councillors who had so warmly supported her cause had certainly not imagined that by doing so they would shut the door of preferment against themselves, and what hope of promotion or power could remain during the reign of a queen who had thus openly announced her intention of acting entirely for herself. The prejudices of the people who, too wounded, had been accustomed to the promises of reformation and the relief of taxation upon the accession of a new sovereign, that they were disappointed at not receiving them, although they knew from experience that they meant nothing. Just as persons fond of flattery cannot live without it, though they are well acquainted with its fallacy. Besides, even experience cannot make some people wise, and though the hopes of the English had been so often disappointed, it was pleasant still to have something held out to them to hope for. These thoughts arose in the breasts of the multitude, and a rising murmur was beginning to swell upon the ear, when the assembly was hushed to silence by perceiving Lord Noodle had risen, and was about to address them. "My lords and gentlemen," said he, "it is with feelings of considerable embarrassment that I rise to address you. Everything that can be said has been said, and everything that has been said ought to have been said, and everything that ought to have been said has been said. What then can there possibly be left for me to say? Let it not be supposed, however, by my saying this, that I have nothing to say for myself. On the contrary, I think everybody must be allowed to have a great deal upon the said subject." Here the noble lord tittered at his own wit, as well as it had done so, as if he had not, perhaps nobody would have found it out. "Say what I will, however, one thing must be clear, and that is—" If I was to speak for an hour, I could not say any more. "That is, that you must have a queen, and that you cannot choose a better one than the noble lady who has just sat down. And so, gentlemen, having finished, I think I cannot do better than follow her example." Shouts and roars of laughter followed his speech, to the infinite delight of the enlightened orator, and he bowed and bowed on all sides, till his head and bobbing little periwig seemed to have acquired a gift of perpetual motion. No sooner was the tumult a little subsided than Elvira came forward to address the people. When her veil was removed, her agitation was extreme. Elvira was delicately fair, and the eloquent blood spoke in her cheeks in 1,000 varying tints. For a few seconds she stood. Her eyes were fixed upon the ground, apparently endeavoring to collect herself. Then, raising her eyes, she seemed on the point of speaking, but her courage failed her as she surveyed the immense multitude, every eye fixed upon her, and every ear listening for her words. The sounds died upon her lips, and after an ineffectual attempt to speak, she buried her face in her veil and sobbed aloud. Who can describe the agitation of her aged father at this moment? When she appeared, he had risen, and leaning forward listened with fearful eagerness, as though his ear would drink in every syllable, and as though his own death warrant hung upon her words. He became pale when he saw her agitation, and his countenance varied with every variation of hers, till, when he saw her total inability to speak, his lips became with livid whiteness, he uttered a piercing shriek, and fell senseless to the ground. A bustle immediately took place, and the Duke was carried off, and Elvira remained pale, trembling, and almost fainting, leaning against one of the pillars that supported the canopy over the platform upon which she stood. An awful pause ensued, which was at last broken by Lord Edmund rushing forward, and eagerly addressing the crowd in the following words. "My friends and countrymen, if one spark of kindness and compassion dwell in your breasts, if your hearts are open to noble feelings, if you can pity defenseless age and hopeless womanhood, listen to me now. Here, whilst I plead the cause of the timid female before you, who, agitated by the solemn occasion for which you are all convened, and awed by the august majesty of this assembly, finds it impossible to give vent to her feelings in words, for difficult indeed it is to express by words the strong emotions of the heart. Oh, would to heaven, my friends, that I could lay her heart open before you, that you would be able to read the love for her country, and the devotion to your dearest interests, and the generous wish to sacrifice her domestic happiness to secure yours, that prompt her to this day to appear before you. Do you fear tyranny? Is this trembling woman likely to impose it? Do you wish remission from oppression? Is not she who cares evidently poses in such extreme sensibility likely to remove those cares? Can her breast, which now sobs with emotion, ever be deaf to your cries of misery. No, no, that gentle spirit which shrinks from exposure in this garish light of day will devote itself to soothing your woes and to lightening your burdens. Do you wish for victory? Has not my arm been hitherto successful? And am I not devoted to Elvira? My countrymen, I plead not from my interested motives. God knows I do not. Nay, there may be some among you who know I am now plead for the destruction of my dearest hopes, but my welfare of my country is more to me than my own. I give my country the treasure that might have been mine, contented if by the sacrifice of my own happiness I can secure that of thousands. My countrymen, I cannot more strongly prove my devotion to your interests, for if you choose Elvira for your queen, my widowed heart will have no bride to glory. Take, however, the treasure I resign to you, prize her as she deserves, and heaven in its mercy grant that prudent counsellors and sagacious statesmen may so direct her steps that victory may shine upon her banners, wisdom in her counsel, and happiness for her kingdom. Lord Edmund stopped, overpowered by his own emotions, and his hesitation found an echo in the bosom of every auditor. The effect of his speech was instantaneous cries of "Elvira shall be our queen! Elvira forever!" rose in deafening tumult from the crowd, nor did there appear a single discontent in voice. In fact, after all that has been said upon the subject, feeling is only true eloquence. The passions of the crowd were strongly excited, and the fainting of the Duke, the agitation of Elvira, and the speech of Lord Edmund, who was the hero of the day, absolutely had driven them distracted. They shouted again and again that Elvira and Elvira alone should be queen, and forming a triumphant car, placed her in it, and dragged her along to Westminster Abbey, where the ceremony for the coronation was appointed to take place. This venerable pile, which had stood for centuries, and resisted like war of nature the destroying of hand of invasion, with which the barbarous taste of the Middle Ages had endeavored to destroy its grandeur, shone forth in all its original splendor, and afforded another magnificent proof of the length of time the labors of man survive the term of this fragile existence. It had been a brilliant sight when Westminster was crowded with the nobles of the land to choose the Council of State, but far more splendid was it now, when after the religious part of the ceremony was coronation had been performed in the Abbey, the trembling and beautiful queen entered its sumptuous walls, surrounded by her councillors, and welcomed with transport by her kneeling subjects. All had been previously prepared for the ceremony, as the ordinance of the old queen had directed the coronation to take place immediately after the election, and the venerable hall was now crowded with nobles and ladies of Claudia's court, splendidly attired, waiting for the queen, and the choice of the deputies might give them, with the most eager impatience. Elvira was received with transports, and though, perhaps under different circumstances, her rival might have been honored with equal rapture. Yet, as Elvira knew it, the thought did not damp her pleasure. In the meantime, Father Morris had remained aghast, a prey to the combined tortures of grief, age, and disappointment. The crowd had disappeared, yet still he stood gazing upon the platform, a speechless image of despair. "For heaven's sake, do not remain here!" cried a voice he knew only too well, and obeying the impulse of Marianne's arm, he suffered himself to be led to the scaffold, where all hopes had perished. There was a small house at no great distance from the spot where the partisans of Rosabella had held frequent conferences respecting their plans for securing her election, and to the place Marianne led the disappointed friar. "Curses on the fiend that has betrayed me to my ruin," said he, and he threw himself upon the sofa in the abode. "May demons haunt him here, and eternal misery be his portion forever." The fiendish laugh of Cheops rang in the father's ears as he pronounced these words, and ere he finished, the hated form of the mummy stood before him. "What, Father Morris?" cried the Egyptian. "Is this your treatment of your friends? Fie, fie! Is there strength of mind? I am ashamed of you. It is the part of the man of courage to shrink from such a slight reverse. However, I am still your friend, and if you follow my advice..." "Avaunt, demon!" cried Father Morris. "Tempt me no more. Ruin hangs upon thy words, and it is thy advice that destroyed me."
"Say rather your own evil passions," returned the mummy.
"Fiend!" exclaimed the monk. "Was it not by thy advice Rosabella rejected the address I had prepared for, and determined to deliver her own sentiments and powder?"
"Such an expression of her genuine feelings was likely to produce tenfold the times of the studied address. The oration of Lord Edmund was from a feeling of the moment, and you saw its power was magical."
"And it was not by your desire that the fool Lord Noodle seconded her, instead of Lord Gustavus, as I had intended?"
"A ridiculous fool was more likely to put the people in a good humor than a posing one."
Yes, I know. It was thus you made the plan seem feasible, but how have they succeeded?"
"Success is not always a test of merit. How could I foresee the fainting of the Duke and the agitation of Elvira? That timid silence was far more than her words. If she had spoken, she would have had no chance."
"Would she be dead?" said Father Morris, grinding his teeth.
"So would you seal your ruin. Rosabella would be suspected and her chance of reigning destroyed. Destroyed forever."
"And what shall I do?"
"Let Elvira reign. Nay, start not, for it is but time that she will naturally make Edmund her first counselor from gratitude for the service he has rendered her, and as he has the sense and talent, he will as naturally either reject employing the noble lords who were your friends entirely, or at best give them the subordinate situations. Their hopes had been previously raised that they will be disappointed bitterly and look back with longing eyes to Rosabella, by whom they were promised place of power. That princess must moderate her natural haughtiness. If she wished to reign, she must submit and bend to the rise. For though ambition may be the lofty of all passions, perhaps no one makes its verities occasionally condescend to the great meanness. At present, patience alone is required. Novelty is always delightful, but the pleasure it produces can never be lasting, and the expectations of men having been raised too high by the brilliancy with which a new government is certain to commence, they will soon be disposed to quarrel with everything that may chance fall short of the standard they will then propose themselves, though the same standard, if they give themselves time to consider, they would find far too exalted for mortals to ever have hopes of reaching. Their extravagant expectations not being realized, they will then plunge into the opposite extreme. They will see everything with a jaundiced eye, and, not liking to own they find themselves deceived, they will overturn the government of our ride and conceal forever the folly they have been guilty of."
"But will not the government of Rosabella afterwards share the same fate?"
"No, for they will have tanned my wisdom by experience, and having just suffered from the inconveniences inseparable from a revolution, they will idolize every word and action of Rosabella, to spare themselves the necessity of again going under the same orders, and yet avoid the change of inconsistency. They will thus fear even to conjure, and will gloss over anything that may not quite please them, rather than run the risk of again interrupting the tranquillity which the late disturbance has made them taste the sweets of."
The sophistry of Cheops was well suited for the feelings of his hearers, and well did he know how to work upon the passions of those he conversed with. The indignation of Father Morris and Marianne subsided, and they again began the Egyptians' devoted slaves. Cheops watched them as they retired, a smile of derision curling his haughty lips.
"Fools that they are," he said,
as again the fearful expression flashed across his saturnine countenance.
"By Typhon, they are scarcely worth deceiving, for they rush blindfold into the net."
In the meantime, nothing could exceed the grandeur of the scene exhibited in Westminster Hall. The ceremony was finished, for the Queen had taken oaths of fidelity to the interests of the new subjects, and had received their humblest homage in return. The sumptuous banquet was now served, where all that could please the eye mingled in luxuriant profusion with all that could tempt the appetite. Music completed the charm, and as the harmonious notes swelled through the lofty dome, it seemed a choir of angels rejoicing from on high. Thus, whilst all could gratify the senses of combined, the fair loveliness of Elvira seemed to fit her well to the goddess of the scene, and the figure of the poor old Duke, her father, gazing with her with indescribable rapture, the tears trickling down his furrowed cheeks, and his long white hair hanging loose upon his shoulders, completed the interest of the picture. Great and glorious was the triumph of Elvira, but whilst the nation rang with an acclamation of joy, and bonfires and illuminations preceded the transport of the people, who shall paint the despair, the desolation of the unfortunate Rosabella? Forlorn and deserted by her friends, and despised and injured by him she loved, disappointed in the fairy dreams of her ambition, and disgusted with a world that had rejected her. What could she do? Where find a refuge for her woes? Rosabella sought no refuge. Wretched as she was, her proud spirit still supported her. She neither retired from society, nor gave herself up as the paroxysms of despair. Hers was not a mind to brood over useless grief. She felt her wrongs, it is true, and most keenly did she feel them, but she wasted not her time in lamentation, and burnt only to avenge them. Marianne had communicated to her the advice of Cheops, and her whole soul was now devoted to revenge. For this she determined to obey his injunctions, to bend her haughty spirits to his wishes, to conciliate her friends that had deserted her, and to submit to any meanness to keep up a party in the state. This done, she resolved to watch for the errors unavoidable by the new government, to take advantage of every weakness, and to foment every discontent. In short, to open a chasm under her rival's feet, and then, like a lion Prince Mar on the brink of a sandy trap, to rest concealed until the entanglement of its expected prey enabled her to rush upon it and destroy it. Elvira's disposition was naturally noble, and satisfied with the possession of the throne, she sought no farther triumph. Her generous soul was touched by the apparent resignation of her rival, and she endeavored, by every means in her power, to console her for her disappointment. The Duke had quitted upon the country, and now resided entirely with his daughter, whilst upon Rosabella, Elvira, with utmost delicacy, conferred a palace with a separate establishment. Notwithstanding, however, the delicacy with which Elvira's favors were conferred, Rosabella could not forget they were favors, and hers was not a mind to brook dependence. She hated her cousin thus increased with the weight of her obligations, whilst that of Elvira had vanished with the occasion that gave it birth. It is, indeed, scarcely possible for a proud, haughty temper, like that of Rosabella's, to love the person to whom she owes everything. Such dispositions find infinitely more pleasure in obliging than to be obliged, pride being gratified in one case and humbled in the other. People are thus often devotedly attached to their protégés, as they seem, in some measure, creations of their own, and lavish favors upon them with a profuse hand. But they often expect such devotion in return, that love withers into slavery, and changes into hatred, and at once gratitude soon becomes mortification. Elvira had an arduous part to sustain. It was difficult to find the medium between giving too much and too little, and more difficult still to discover a means of giving at all, without hurting the feelings of Rosabella. The sense she had of this rendered the manner of Elvira towards her cousin occasionally cold and restrained, and Rosabella felt acutely the slightest change. She indeed saw everything with a jaundiced eye. She imagined insults where none were intended. She shrank from the slightest observation that could be supposed to allude to her present situation, and she appeared to feel as much pain whenever she was in the society of Elvira, that the intercourse between the cousins gradually dwindled to a mere formal interchange of visits and the customary ceremonies of court etiquette. The cousins, thus completely estranged from each other, Rosabella's palace became a resort of the discontented. The King of Ireland had died soon after the departure of the Duke of Cornwall for the country, and those malcontents, formerly in his pay, being repulsed by his son, now crowded around Rosabella. Men of talents, but of dissolute habits, daring spirits that preyed upon themselves for want of employment, and desperate characters to whom every change was agreeable, as they had nothing to lose and everything to hope for by a revolution, vied with each other in devoting themselves to her service. It was often grating to Rosabella's feelings to associate with wretches such as these, but to what cannot proud spirits sometimes submit, to gain the determined purpose of their souls? Everything is swallowed up in one vast overwhelming passion, and the minor difficulties are neither seen, thought of, nor felt. Thus Rosabella scripted not to waste her time in the society of such beings as Lord Noodle and his friend Lord Doodle. She even stooped to flattering, and occasionally to ask, and to appear to follow their advice. She endured patiently the dictatorial prosing of Lord Gustavus, and listened with an appearance of interest to the wearisome pettiness of Lord Maysworth. And she thought of, or was rather in the particular line of conduct were likely to conduct the placing of her on the throne, and if it were, be what it might, the haughty Rosabella instantly consented to practice it. Taught by the late events not to rely too confidently upon her own strength, she rushed into the opposite extreme, and descended even into servility. In the meantime, the attention of Elvira was completely devoted to the establishment of her government. She had many qualities worthy of her rank, and some of the most conspicuous were her nobleness in forgetting injuries, and the inflexible sense of justice. Though she made no promises herself to the people on the day of her election, she justly considered those made by Edmund on her part of equal bidding, and endeavored by every means in her power to redeem the pledges he had given. Cheops had judged rightly in supposing she would make Edmund her prime minister. Her gratitude to him, indeed, was unbounded, and though her noble and generous disposition prevented her from depriving the lords who had voted against her their dignities, yet that the strong mind and commanding genius of Edmund would make them dwindle in nonnities. He had also been equally content in predicting. The noble lords, quite unconscious of their own inefficiency, were indignant at finding themselves subalterns when they had hoped to be commanders, and rallied around the standard of Rosabella, who, on her part, received them so graciously that her former haughtiness was forgiven. Elvira was not aware of their defection, or if she were, she thought them too insignificant to merit notice, her being entirely occupied by the affairs in which she considered of infinitely more importance. Though the laws of the old queen had been excellent, many abuses crept into the manner of putting them into execution, and these Elvira, now with the aid of Edmund, set herself diligently to work to discover and correct. She could not, indeed, have chosen an assistant more competent to the task. The penetrating mind and commanding genius of Edmund were unequalled. With a slight glance, he saw where the errors had been committed, and how they ought to be amended. Whilst under his auspices, vice was punished and virtue rewarded. Goodness, though in rags, was raised to affluence, and villainy compelled to disgorge its ill-gotten wealth. Justice was impartially dispensed to all. On the first Monday of every month, the Queen proceeded in solemn state to the grand square of Blackheath, to receive there, in person, the petitions of her subjects. The crowd assembled upon these occasions was immense. However, well a constitution may be organized, it is impossible to give satisfaction to everyone, and under the best regulated governments there will always be some fancy themselves aggrieved. Besides, as free access was allowed on these occasions to everyone, numbers went merely to see the Queen, and nothing could better be contrived than letting Her Majesty know the real feelings of her subjects, and this arrangement. And as the people being placed in lines, along each of which the Queen walked, she became alternately in personal contact with every separate individual. Like everything else, however, that sounds perfect in theory. Difficulties arose when this plan came to be put into practice. It was originally intended that the Queen should receive, with her own hands, and read herself, all the petitions that might be presented. But when it found their numbers frequently amounted to some thousands, this scheme was abandoned as impracticable, and Lords Noodle and Doodle were appointed to the important office of walking behind the Queen, carrying large bags in which the petitions were deposited, and from which they could probably never see again, if they had not been dragged to light by the persevering and indefatigable exertions of Lord Edmund. The people, however, were not aware of this, and there was something in the show that delighted them. It was indeed a fine sight to behold so many hundreds of beings anxiously watching the movements of their beautiful queen as she glided among their ranks, smiling graciously upon all, and looked like an angel sent upon earth to dispense blessings to mankind. Ladies of honor walked behind her, the pages bearing their train, and the two aged councillors of state, bending beneath the weight of their ponderous bags, bringing up the rear. Thus gloriously commenced Elvira's reign. The people, delighted with the attention paid to their wishes, and struck by some instances of the Queen's love of justice and hatred of oppression, lauded her to the skies. The nobility, hoping riches and power from her liberality, almost worshipped her, and the ambassadors of foreign powers, dreading the valor of Lord Edmund and his soldiers, offered the humblest homage at her feet. In short, all seemed to smile upon her, and the kingdom to bid fair shortly to rival even the imagined happiness of Utopia itself.